Okay, we're just going to close the door just to make sure we have some quiet. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristen Wong-Tam, and I'm the MPP for Toronto Centre. I'm also the official opposition critic for the Ministry of the Attorney General. Today, we are here at Queen's Park to speak about a very pressing and urgent matter, and that is about how Ontario's residents are being treated by the government and the criminal justice system. Joining me on the podium this morning is Deputy Leader of the Official Opposition NDP, Sol Mamakwa, who is also a co-sponsor of a new bill that we have tabled as of yesterday. We are also joined by Jennifer Chambers, who is the Executive Director of Empowerment Council, Emily Coyle, the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and I'm deeply honored to have the presence with us today, the mother of Solomon Fakiri, as well as his brother, Yusuf Fakiri. On December the 6th, 2016, Solomon Fakiri was temporarily housed at the Central East Correctional Centre in Lindsay, Ontario. He was waiting for a bed, a mental health bed, at the Ontario Shore Centre. Solomon was previously diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was having some very urgent mental health needs. And these mental health needs, were also identified by the correctional staff in the facility, as well as his family. Repeated requests by the Fakiri family to see him during Solomon's time in custody was denied. Only 11 days later, on December the 15th, 2016, Solomon Fakiri was killed while under government care, following an altercation with the guards. His body was found restrained with his hands behind his back, restraints placed on his ankles. He was pepper sprayed, and his face was covered with a spit hood. There were ligature marks around his ankles and wrists, and his body was covered with over 50 bruises. There was also a very large laceration across his forehead. All of this was confirmed in the independent coroner's report. Solomon Fakiri was neither the first nor last individual with mental health disabilities to die in an Ontario prison. The Fakiri family has been bravely speaking out for years now, and supported by the official opposition NDP, asking and calling for accountability for the acts of violence inflicted on their son and brother while under government care. The family has been calling on the government of Ontario to reform the province's correctional system to ensure greater transparency of information and deep accountability when it comes to training and dealing with people living with mental health who are in crisis. The jury from the coroner's inquest made 57 recommendations directed at the provincial government. The very first recommendation, was calling on the government to develop and issue a public statement within 60 days of this verdict, recognizing that correctional facilities are not an appropriate environment for persons in custody experiencing significant mental health issues. The jury also deemed that Solomon Fakiri's death was preventable, tragic, and a homicide. It is now 157 days since the inquest recommendations were released. I have shared with you simply one out of the 57 recommendations. There are many, many more, including calling on the government to transfer correctional health care from the Ministry of the Solicitor General to the Ministry of Health by establishing a provincial agency within the Ministry of Health to deliver and oversee healthcare services in correctional facilities. This is very similar to a program that was initiated in British Columbia in 2017. The recommendations go much further and much deeper. We will not have time to identify all the recommendations for you today, but the very first recommendation is the pinnacle. It will lay down the foundation to how we in Ontario address mental health crises. It should never be with corrections. People living with mental health crises are not criminals. They are sick and they need our help. I would like to introduce Emily Coyle, the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. She will be speaking next. And following Emily, we'll hear from Jennifer Chambers, the Executive Director of the Empowerment Council. And following Jennifer, we're going to hear from Yusuf Fakiri, the family spokesperson on behalf of the mother and his sisters, and on behalf of Solomon, who is no longer here to speak for himself.
I stand here today, side by side with the Fakiri family, to urge this government to begin by developing and issuing a public position statement recognizing that correctional facilities are not an appropriate environment for persons in custody who are experiencing significant mental health issues. This recommendation is not mine, as you've just heard. It is the first of the 57 recommendations that came out of the inquest into the death of Soliman Fakiri, the beloved family member of the people who stand before you today. A public statement that acknowledges the harms of the prison system on people with mental health considerations is in fact the bare minimum that this government and other governments could be doing. Earlier this year, our organization participated in an inquest into the death of Terry Baker, a young woman who died in the same segregation cells as Ashley Smith at the Grand Valley Institution for Women. That inquest yielded 67 recommendations. Terry, Ashley, Soliman, and many others needed mental health treatment and care, but instead they were met with the punitive response that is characteristic of our Canadian prisons and jails. With one of the primary purposes of public inquests being to put forward recommendations to prevent similar deaths from occurring in the future, it is impossible not to wonder what is going wrong. There is no denying the fact that people with mental illness are being incarcerated in our country at incredibly high rates. Just yesterday in the Toronto Star, a story was released about the incarceration of a woman with mental illness, despite repeated pleas by her husband, the alleged victim, to not arrest her and to take her to a hospital. She spent 10 months in jail. A December 2022 Ontario Coroner's report told us that the dominant profile of the population, which means the incarcerated population of Ontario's jails, has become one of complex needs that require health care, mental health care, addictions treatment and recovery, and transition supports that can facilitate continuity of care and success at living in the community. But most importantly, it went on to say, almost none of these things can be provided to the required degree in any of our prisons. Once incarcerated, people with mental illness are being harmed. People with mental illness are dying. People with mental illness are being killed. In order to stop and prevent harm from happening, we must focus on the bigger picture. Tinkering around the edges of a punitive carceral system is going to continue to reproduce the harms that Soliman, Terry, Ashley, and so many others have and are experiencing. Systemic change can only happen when broader actions are taken, like those in the bill that you have discussed, and Bill S-230, for example, a Senate bill which would, among other things, make it the law that if a person who is sentenced, transferred, or committed to a penitentiary with a disabling mental health issue, they will immediately be transferred to a hospital. Soliman Fakiri was a beloved family member. He could have been my family member. He could have been your family member. Urgent action needs to happen now before more of our loved ones are taken from us.
I'm outraged at the death of Suleiman Fakiri and the lack of accountability that has ever occurred as a result of it. There are so many people involved. There are so many chances to turn away from causing his death. And unlike many inquests, there's no point at which people could say they feared for their lives. No one but Suleiman himself. The Fakiri family deserves an apology and a commitment that no one will die the way their brother and son died. I've testified at the inquests of Hassan. We had standing at the inquest of Ashley Smith. We've been asking for inquest after inquest for independent advocacy within the correctional system, and we have not achieved it. A most important result of the inquest would be to bring an independent, rational, compassionate perspective to how prisoners are treated in the correctional system, especially prisoners with mental health issues. There needs to be accessible advocacy available to prisoners that is independent of corrections. At what point, when Soli was being dragged down the hall, beaten and pepper sprayed, was he supposed to ask for a form from his guards that he would then return to them to be mailed to request for help? It's ludicrous. And equally important, because no advocate can be anywhere, or everywhere rather, it's my belief there has to be individual ethical responsibility in the form of peer intervention for everyone working in corrections. And that includes healthcare workers who also did nothing to intervene with his brutal death. Peer intervention has to be reinforced by on-the-job supervision and rewards and sanctions and protection from retribution. It seems that sentencing some people to death in Canada is acceptable if we repeatedly allow these deaths to occur and do nothing to prevent them. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Dear Ontarians, dear Canadians, my mom and I don't want to be here today. We shouldn't be here today. But more than 7.5 years since Solomon's beating death by correctional officers at the Central East Correctional Center, our hands are being forced to continue to fight back because of government's collective indifference and inaction for the mentally ill, for the voiceless, for the ones whose only suffering is already enough. Yet here we are as we stand before you this morning, asking for government, pleading with government, that enough is enough, that we need to change the system, that we need to save lives. This is not just a policy decision. These are brothers, sons, mothers, sisters whose lives are being lost because of government's indifference, as if their lives are viewed as cheap. Ladies and gentlemen, Ontarians, Canadians, as you're listening to this press conference, imagine what it feels to fight for 7 years for an inquiry. Imagine that inquiry provides you with the agonizing truth that your loved one was killed in prison by the guards at the institution. And then imagine silence. Imagine 60 policy breaches. Imagine visiting your loved one 4 times only to be turned back. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, having no accountability. Imagine as if your loved one's voice in his death has never been acknowledged by the very institution or government that is responsible for his death. The Premier claims to care for ordinary Ontarians. He does not even acknowledge that your loved one's death. This is my family story, ladies and gentlemen. How many tragic deaths and inquests do we need until governments do their duty to protect our most vulnerable and transform the correctional system that are preventable deaths? They're a result of cynical government programs that turn away from those that need it most. My family deserves a public apology from Premier Doug Ford and the Ontario government for the beating death of Suleiman Fakiri. My family deserves this apology because this isn't just about Suleiman Fakiri. This is about a man who suffered from mental illness that it could be any one of us. We deserve that public apology. And that public apology needs to be given by the Premier and this government. Solomon mattered. He had a story to tell. And his story was not those final moments on December 15, 2016, as he mercilessly lost his life, as he was being beaten to death. Yet a coroner's inquest laid it for all of us, ladies and gentlemen, that his death was a homicide. Yet almost 6 months since that inquest, the government has done nothing in addressing those inquest recommendations, especially that inquest, one of them being that we need, and it's not just me or Jennifer or Emily Coyle or other advocates, about correction having oversight. That was one of the crux, one of the planks of that recommendation that came out of the inquest. Yet we don't have that. Corrections needs to have independent oversight because there's going to be more deaths like Suleiman. Avant que je termine, je vais dire quelques mots en français.
I would like to speak a few words in English. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Imagine what you would feel when you fight for over 7 years to obtain an inquest. Imagine that this inquest will reveal an atrocious truth that your brother has been killed by correctional agents. And following that, there is a silence. Prime Minister keeps pretending that he cares for ordinary Ontarians, but he does not even recognize the death of your loved one. This is the story of my family for over 7 years. My family deserves an accuse from the government for the brutal death of Suleiman Fakiri. How many tragic deaths and inquests do we need to have before the government assumes his responsibility and protects the most vulnerable and reforms our correctional system and to avoid further deaths? But this government is cynic and does not recognize those who need help. Imagine how many times we had to fight in order to obtain information concerning my brother and my mother and myself. We did not want to be in front of you today, but we were forced to speak before you.
And Canadians, we will not go away. We will not go away, even if we want to. Believe me, even if we want to move forward, we will not go away. Because even though Suleiman was given to his mother in a body bag, there's many Suleimans that are alive now that might be given to their loved ones in a body bag. We're fighting for them. Our hands are being forced because the system needs to change. We will not go away until the system changes. And it starts with these inquest recommendations, all of them to be implemented. We'll be following it very closely. And it starts with the government apologizing for the death of Suleiman Fakiri, with the government not just referring to him as an inmate. This was a human being. I'm going to leave you with this final remarks, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to say the names of victims that have lost their lives at the hands of the correctional system the last few years. Just the most recent, Ibrahim Ali in the Toronto South Detention Center. Let's say their names. Ibrahim Ali, Anthony Chatsomalakis, Cass Geddes, Abdurrahman Hassan, Ibrahim Ali, Justin Saint-Amour, Jordan Sherrod, Ashley Smith, Suleiman Fakiri. These are brothers, sisters, fathers, human beings that deserve better. But the indifference and the lack of scrutiny and corrections cost their lives. Their story needs to be detailed, and their death should not be in vain. Solomon Fikiri's death will not be in vain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yusuf. I opened this press conference by telling you Solomon's story. And clearly, Solomon's story has touched so many because we've been hearing from Ontarians about how they feel about their own loved ones in correction facilities. To this day, I know that there are families who can't reach their loved ones who are in government custody. So much more needs to be done, which is why we have tabled a bill that calls upon the government to ensure that Ontarians living with mental health crises are not treated with the criminal justice system, because that is not the right prescription. We call on the government to fast-track our private members' bill and to begin the work that's easily laid out in the recommendations of the coroner's inquest and take it into action and put it into funding, into the upcoming 2024 budget, 2025 budget, because that needs to happen as well. We're here to answer any questions that there are from the media now.
Just a question for the family, Yusuf. Has anyone from the province reached out to your family since the inquest, or not at all?
Not at all. Radio silence. Sorry. Not at all. Radio silence, neither the minister or the premier.
And do you feel there has been some kind of acknowledgement of the recommendations, or not even?
None whatsoever, other than a very comprehensive coroner's inquest was happening independently, but on the government's end, they just missed the 60-day deadline to begin with, the most easiest one they haven't done. So nothing has happened, and we're approaching 6 months since that inquest completed.
Can I ask you the same question in French?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Est-ce que vous avez...
Did you have any communication with the province and the government? Answer: no, nothing. This is radio silence. Neither the minister or the solicitor general or the premier.
So we know that the government rarely supports an opposition bill. Have you had any kind of indication that they might be open to seeing this bill going through the process and maybe going to committee?
So you're absolutely right. Private members' bills are rarely adopted by the government, and I say this in a way that it's rare. But it's also important to recognize that the bill that we've put forward, is not ours. We are simply taking the very first recommendation of the coroner's independent inquest and prioritizing that one, because it actually allows us to cascade all of that thinking, a rethinking about how we treat mental illness and mental health crises in Ontario, so that there's a whole of government approach to making sure it's treated as a health condition and not as a crime. And clearly lives are on the line, and clearly the quality of life for families who are worried about their loved ones inside corrections is at the forefront of why we're doing it. And I think it's important for us to recognize that there's a population that's overrepresented in jails who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, but mental illness does not discriminate. Everybody and every family has someone with a mental illness. And if they fall into crisis, I would hate to think that you're going to send the police. You need to send healthcare professionals. And they need to get the treatment that they deserve. And they need to get the treatment while they're in custody, before it's too late. Any other questions?
We do have a caller on the line. Stand by, please.
Thank you.
There is a call from the teleconference. Alan Hale at Queen's Park today.
Hi there. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Alan.
Okay, wonderful. So I was wondering if you had, what is your family doing now that you have the inquest ruling? Are you going to be suing the province? What does your family do from here, given that the government doesn't seem to want to talk to you about this?
We're going to keep fighting, and we're going to be calling out the government. We're linking up with families, having press conference such as this, and not letting Solomon's story be forgotten. And because the government seems to be under the impression that Solomon's case will go away. It's not going away. Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching 8 years, and his case is still very much live and well. And my mom has told me, do not stop until the system changes. And that's what we're going to do. We're not giving up, even though we should try to move forward. But these are lives that are at the line.
Mm-hmm. This is not a very complicated bill. It is just asking for a recognition of something. Do you think that there'll be any kind of tangible difference by this bill being passed? Or what do you expect to happen if the government does decide to pass this bill?
The justice for Soli Act, which is what we're calling it, which really leads to the stopping of criminalization of mental health, allows us to set a foundation for how government moves forward with treating people living with mental health and who are in crisis. And it is important to know and recognize that the 57 recommendations coming out of the coroner's independent inquests are all directed at the provincial government, all 57 of them. So the government has been called upon to receive, review, adopt, and to act on those recommendations. I've pulled out the top recommendation, because I think it's the foundation that everything else should be built upon. If the government can't develop a position that 60 different civil society organization, mental health advocates have strongly supported, then they're not fit to govern. They're not able to do their job, because this issue is about saving lives. It's about families. It's about Ontarians. And the advocates that you see here on the stage today, they are easily representing thousands and tens of thousands more of families who want to see the reform of the criminal justice system. And they want to see that this government is going to shift their thinking, their policy, their legislation, their services to ensure that mental health is treated as such, a health issue, and not a criminal act.
Doug Ford has always said he's on the he has the backs of like police officers. Like he hasn't expressed any sympathy for Umar Zamir after his case, and I'm just wondering if you think the PCs are likely to support this when it might be seen as like them undermining correctional officers. Like, if they're motivated to have the backs of correctional officers on this, what does that say?
I have spoken to a number of correctional officers, including those that work in parole and probation. They have been calling on this government and the previous Liberal government for years to ensure that training and resources are adequate so that they can do their job safely. And I think it's important for us to recognize that this requires a whole of government approach. And the recommendations in the Fakiri inquest speak to 57 different things that need to change in order for the system to work. So you have seen me here at the media studio speaking about the delays in the tribunal system, in the civil courts, in the criminal courts, in the family courts. The system, as it speaks to justice, is not working. So Doug Ford saying that he's going to be backing corrections officers or backing the police officers is nonsense, because he's not being smart about it. And the recommendation is simply, the recommendations from the coroner's inquest is an action plan to fix the problem. And this problem is his now for 6 years, and he's done nothing about it.
Thank you.
Just to respond.
No more questions on the teleconference.
I was going to have to give your comment there.
Why don't you do that? Sure. Why don't you respond?
Just one more thing, regarding what Kristen Wong-Tam said in your question. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a partisan issue. The government needs to stand on the right side of history, right? This is not a partisan issue. What Kristen Wong-Tam is asking, and what Ontarians are asking, thousands are asking for this crisis to be addressed. We don't want our loved ones in body bags. Is that too much to ask?
Thank you. There are no more questions on the line?
No more questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for attending our press conference today. And thank you to our speakers for traveling from out of town to join us. Thank you to the Fakiri family, to the Empowerment Council, to the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and thank you to our Deputy Leader. Thank you.